Hey Omniverse, this is Dean from Dungeons and Doritos. I just wanted to let you guys in on the first chapter of what's been going on in Dean's life. And this scene starts with Dean's brother in a jail cell. Go!
Accompanied only by the omnipresent sound of his own breath, Ox decrepified slowly within the blackness of his cell. His red hair stuck to his skin in a tangled mop, curling across his firmly chiseled cheekbones and draped itself on an emaciated yet well-muscled shoulder. There was a haunted look in his lurid eyes, and a wild beard enshrouded his face and throat. His lips were cracked with dehydration and the air stung his lungs. He could feel pain in the tips of his fingers, his feet, his insides and his outsides. The passage of time had no meaning, but it was marked by the intermittent deliveries of food, which came in the form of bread and water. Ox twitched in languid alarm as an offensive burst of light penetrated the blackened oblivion. A jailer entered and kicked the jail cell bars, flashing his torch about to discern the livelihood of the jail's captives. Occasionally he would curse and remove a corpse. Sometimes he would throw another unfortunate criminal inside. Because of the undesirable position of such a duty, and the assaulting smell of waste and urine, the dead usually went unnoticed for days on end. The jailer left. Darkness deepened its hold as the booted footsteps gradually faded away into silence. Ox summoned the strength he'd need to reach his meager sustenance. He rose. A vibration of pain exploded in his body, making his skin burn with unadulterated agony. He cried out in shock, but the act was nearly noiseless. His throat tightened into a ball, then retracted as the wave of searing pain diminished to tolerability. Catching his breath, Ox reached out and grasped the edge of a clay bowl. He pressed the edge to his lips and slurped at the water until there was nary a drop left. Without stopping, he quickly forced the bread loaf into his mouth and systematically swallowed pieces of it with his ragged throat. Each morsel burned its way down his esophagus like falling meteorites, to land ever more painfully into his inflamed stomach. He laid back down into the straw he'd piled in the cell's corner, exhausted and resigned. Ox had never known such complete torture, nor had he ever even heard of a pain that matched the intensity of forced starvation, but to transgressors of the Overking's law, such was the appropriate punishment. He knew that the water was laced with toxins designed to further ruin his body, but with dehydration as his only alternative, he was powerless to resist it, lest he die naturally and sooner. In a way, it gave the captive the choice to either prolong and intensify his pain, or end it altogether. Ox was not the type to submit to the demands of others, and it was this very characteristic which had led him into such dire circumstances to begin with. He could feel the poison circulating within himself almost immediately, and his urination came without his calling, staining the cell a dull, brownish yellow. He shook uncontrollably while cold sweat marched across the heat of his skin. His eyes closed. Pain came upon him like primordial diamonds forming in an inferno of suffering. The floor of the cell cracked open and was no more. Ox was falling into a deep chasm, the sensation of it so real, he was lost to reality completely. Only the wretched and penultimate misery of the moment was real. He landed in a Red Sea. The crimson waters splashed noisily as he struggled to right himself. Coming to rest on a jagged coastline, Ox crawled out onto a shore of bones and viscera which undulated with the crawling of white insects. Black mountains in the distance were crested with ashy, gray clouds which pulsated dimly with a thundercloud's persistence. Nearest to the shoreline were cliffs, presumably leading up to where he fell from. A howling wind pervaded the ghastly land, blowing the torn strips of red banners which streamed from barbed iron spears. Fear suddenly descended upon him. He knew that he was not alone. A shriek pierced his heart by the sheer intensity of its terrific wailing, and the red ocean began to bubble as though it were boiling. Foam erupted to reveal the black form of something that was not quite man and not quite octopus, an unearthly visage which oozed with dark ichor. Its face was that of a man's skull, dripping with wax-like liquid and casting a withering gaze from several sets of glowing green eyes. Tentacles ensnared Ox and brought him up to that shrieking, melting face, and his own terror became so palpable that it paralyzed the very breath in his lungs. Green light gave way to white light as the creature's mouth opened and he was sent flying into an endless, expansive universe of which he seemed to be the center of. His pain and terror had crested, and the slow descent from his drug-induced terror coma was beginning. The whiteness became lights, which became stars, which became dust, which finally turned into the familiarity of his lifeless jail cell. Ox's eyes stung with sweat, and tears streamed down his face in the ominous blackness of reality, which seemed somehow worse than facing the terrifying beasts in the dark corners of his mind. His only consolation were his memories, and his defiant persistence to survive this hellish ordeal. A voice came. "I thought you'd died," it said. Ox turned an ear to the direction from which the voice came and replied, "Only a little more than last time." Her laugh was weak. Ox could tell that she was nearing her end. He'd seen many men die, some bedside and some bladeside, and he could audibly discern from her voice alone that it wouldn't be too much longer before he'd see her corpse hauled out of the dungeon's stultifying grasp. "You went so long without breath. Eon must have a great purpose in store for you." Ox laughed a rasping laugh. "Shadows to Eon and Eon's purpose." Ox hissed, "Pray all you like, but light will never reach this place." A length of silence stretched itself out between the two barely surviving occupants of the dungeon. Ox peered over to see into her cell. He could make out the form of a woman huddled in the corner and discerned the shapes of her untouched bread and water. "You're not eating?" he queried. "No," she said. "You should pour out the water and eat the bread." Her voice was a piano playing the final notes of a tragic retardando.
"Take her water."
Ox slid over to the bars, reached a hand into the adjoining room, retrieved the bread and knocked the saucer of water over. He was chewing on the bread when she spoke again. "I will do my best to die upright. Perhaps it will fool the jailers for a time." Ox finished the bread. "Thanks," he muttered, understanding the generous nature of her subterfuge. He'd be able to subsist a bit more thoroughly on double rations. "Giving up then?" he asked noncommittally. "I won't leave this cell alive," she announced. "But Ian's light awaits me. I am not afraid." Ox sneered in the darkness. Above cowards, he despised the religious and all things pious. Even in the sanctity of this woman's Samaritan sacrifice, he couldn't help but feel a certain disdain for her convictions. "I'm glad for you," he mustered, but his words were empty of sympathy. Those who served the edicts of gods were beneath his concern. In his mind, death was the ultimate goal of the religious, as it would put them in the kingdoms of whatever gods they served. In a way, he thought she was getting what she wanted, even if it wasn't what she deserved. "Why did they put you in such a place? You seem a nice woman to me," Ox wondered aloud. The bread was stale and his mouth had already become dried. There was a long moment before she answered, and Ox thought she might have already gone off to see Eon. "Well," she said in a weaker, ashamed voice, "I bear a curse." Ox needed no further explanation. The rigid theocracy of Eon's temple knights permitted none of the abominations outlined in religious scripture. Chief among them were a set of curses dubbed the atrocities. Much like the gifts bestowed to the knightage, the curse imparted unexplainable powers to those born under their influence. But unlike the gifts, those who bore them were typically hunted down, tortured or jailed, as per Ian's will. Ox sometimes viewed his own knightly gift as a curse in of itself, for he seemed always a slave to its unabating call. If Eon saw fit to plague mankind with the burdens of such malignancies, Ox could only imagine the deific pleasure such a being would derive from commanding half of those chosen to be cast down as blasphemers. What choice did this woman have to be born under such ill stars? What choice did Ox have but to be admitted into the knightage, plucked from his mother's arms by an inspector who noted his accelerated learning propensity with a simple test? There was no hiding the gifts. The knightage found everyone eventually. Worse still, was the fact that curses and gifts manifested into their true nature in early adulthood, leaving many to wonder if their destiny was to wield a sword as a knight, or be cut down by one as a heretic. Ox could just as easily have ended up in his cell for the same reasons. Was it a stroke of luck that he'd made it this far in spite of his highly venerated gifts? They seemed a curse to him, each and every one, and all of the chanting and hymns of clerics could fade into silence for all he cared, their holy books vanishing into obscurity, their symbols of power stripped down to mundanity. "I truly am sorry for you," he began sincerely, "but that is not a crime worth being jailed for. There are plenty of ways one can do wickedness in this world, but we've no say in the makings of our bodies. If Eon made you this way, then why do you find comfort in joining with her? Because I know that Eon tests the faith of her devoted children. I know that this was all in her design. If I'm to pass this curse into the Shadowlands, then I must do so with dignity." Poor woman, Ox thought. Those afflicted with atrocities were castigated by the church into believing that they were put to the death as a means to vanquish the powers of Ion, the Lord of Endless Night.
We give this child to
Sometimes
Shadow.
the bearers of curses were executed publicly and willingly,
Witness
as to many
this.
it was interpreted as a selfless act of the highest calling.
She is
The
blessed.
church referred to these women and men as chosen vessels, and often would inscribe their names into the walls of sunlight.
The highest honor.
Why then, was this woman rotting in a cell? Ox's eyes narrowed. He focused on the woman's form, gradually understanding her body's positioning. Something was wrong. Her anatomy was different. From what he could see of her left
What is
side,
wrong
he
with her?
noticed immediately that several smaller arms were protruding from beneath the ragged folds of her rough-spun garment.
Honey, don't touch me.
Malformed, boneless fingers curled out of the ends like the udders of a calf.
Get away from
Her
me.
skin was covered with fleshy extrusions and duplicate limbs of varying sizes and shapes.
I'll never touch you.
Fleshlings. He had heard of their kind. The church preferred to keep their existence a secret. Their curse was a terrible one indeed. Uncontrollable healing power, which caused any wound inflicted upon them to heal with explosive, erratic growths of flesh.
I don't care if we're brothers. Get out.